Hello, BookTube! The first one on my list is Calvin and Hobbes. This is actually the only Calvin and Hobbes book that I own. But I grew up with all of these ones. I'm not entirely sure who these belong to. Either they belong to my parents or my brothers. But they were a very big part of my childhood. They were some of the first books that I really read. I wanted to be Calvin when I was little. I wasn't really cognizant of this when I was little. I just loved them. I thought they were hilarious and wonderful and fantastic. But looking back, I realized that I really admired Calvin's independence. Calvin and Hobbes was just like the epitome of childhood to me, and it has remained that way my entire life. Number 2 is The Hobbit. I read this when I was in 4th grade, not this exact copy. I actually just barely got this a few months ago from my sister. This has illustrations in it from the wonderful cartoon movie of The Hobbit, which was also a very instrumental part of my childhood. Anyways, The Hobbit, I think it made me really fall in love with classic fantasy. I mean, I think I always loved fantasy growing up. The Hobbit made me fall in love with adventures and doing and being part of something that was sort of bigger than yourself, and leaving that comfortable hobbit hole and going out and seeing the world. And I think that's probably where my wanderlust began. Anyways, moving on. Number 3, Where the Red Fern Grows. I picked this for 2 reasons. As I mentioned before, I was in love with fantasy growing up. I didn't really like realistic books, except for Junie B. Jones. I loved the Junie B. Jones series. But my mom read this book to my brother and I. It was a really good bonding moment with family. This one, in particular, was one of my favorites. It was probably the first, really difficult book that I had read or was read to me. I loved the characters, I loved Old Dan and Little Anne, and I wanted hunting dogs so badly. And I'm pretty sure I probably cried when we got to the end of it. It was also a big part of instilling a deep love for books and all sorts of books in me, and the importance of books in families as well. Number 4 is the Harry Potter series, represented here by my beautiful British edition of the 7th book, which I recently acquired when I was in Germany over the summer. I've always wanted the British copies. I grew up with these books. My siblings and I would always go to the midnight releases of both the books and the movies, and more so the books. I remember better standing in line at Barnes & Noble at midnight waiting to get my copy of whatever book it was. The 7th one came out on my birthday, and so my parents got me that one for my birthday, and it was great and fantastic. And I think a lot of them came out in July around the time of my birthday, and I don't know, in my mind I've always kind of thought of Harry Potter as the world's birthday present to me. That sounds really selfish, but that's not why it's influential in my life. It's probably the first fantasy world that I really, really wanted to live in, and while The Hobbit made me fall in love with fantasy adventures, Harry Potter made me fall in love with fantasy worlds, and this idea of escapism through books, and the power of friendship and magic and good versus evil. I don't know. It's just such a big part of my life. Number 5 on my list is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I think I read it towards the end of 7th grade or the beginning of 8th grade. I read it at a time where I was still in this sort of middle world where I wasn't, this little elementary school student anymore, but I wasn't quite in high school yet. I think junior high is just a really formative time for all children. But I think The Little Prince ingrained in me this idea that I never wanted to grow up. Not really in a Peter Pan sort of way, but more in a I don't ever want to stop being able to understand little kids, because I think they see the world in such a pure, unfiltered, uncluttered view. I just never wanted to be one of those adults who's obsessed with facts and figures and numbers and ownership, and I just wanted to live and be happy and not care whether I fix my plane and get out of the desert. Number 6 is the Inkheart series. I read this book, I think either end of 8th grade or 9th grade maybe. I also fell in love with this book and the characters and Maggie and Mo and Dustfinger and Eleanor. And to me, this is the most realistic fantasy I have ever read. Before in my life, fantasy had always been escapism to me, and that was a good thing. And while I still think that escapism is a good thing, Inkheart taught me that maybe it isn't always so great as we think it is. I feel like any other fantasy author for young adults would have taken this idea and made it a lot more desirable and oh, look how great it is to live in these book worlds. But Cornelia Funke doesn't do that. She readily addresses the problems that this whole scenario would create. Although these amazing and fantastic things are possible, there's also consequences and not such amazing things about them. Also, the characters are some of the most real characters I have ever read. I think Maggie is, probably very hard not to love every aspect of her. But there are other good characters that are deeply flawed. There's Mo, who, you love Mo. He's this fantastic bookbinder who loves books and is willing to go to the ends of the earth to save his family. But along with that, he doesn't want to help Dustfinger. He's not willing to do these other good things because, they would jeopardize his family and his life. And then in the later books, when they actually go into the world of Inkheart, he becomes the Blue Jay and has all these moral conflicts, and characters die that you don't think are allowed to die, and they don't just die in a sort of spiteful, I'm the author and I control everything kind of way. No, that would be Fenoglio writing. They die in this sort of realistic, and I'm not just talking about dying, I'm talking about other bad things that happen. These bad things don't happen just to grab your attention and make you keep reading. They happen because that's what would happen in the real world if all of this were real. It has these characters that are so much more relatable and not so idealistic. Number 7 is Anne Frank. I read The Diary of Anne Frank at a very interesting time in my life. I had a really difficult time with friends in high school, and it was all my fault. I found so much solace in reading The Diary of Anne Frank. She was this person that I could look up to, that wasn't someone who you want to be like, but you know that you can never be like them because they're so perfect and so amazing. The thing is, Anne wasn't perfect. I think for much of high school, I really felt like Anne Frank was my best friend. You know, she wrote about all these things that I felt like I could connect to. You know, I will never know what it's like to be hiding from the Nazis. That's never an experience I'll really be able to connect to. But I could connect to her feelings of loneliness and isolation, and her feelings of being misunderstood, and just these normal teenage feelings. And she was able to describe everything so beautifully and wonderfully. Even though she talked about these things, she didn't dwell on them. She also talked about hope and the beauty of the world around her, and being grateful for what they had. And I wanted to be like her so much, and I still want to be like her. This book is probably the most influential book. Number 8 is called Tales from Outer Suburbia by Sean Tan. And I just love those illustrations. He does a lot with collage, and I love collage. I think this probably inspired my desire to become an artist and tell stories through art. I love how happy his art is. I mean, like, it's kind of weird and quirky, but it's not grotesque and yeah, so this just inspired me very artistically. It's made me want to make my art happy. And happy doesn't mean, you know, like rainbows and pretty faces and things like that. Happy can be scuba men in suburban neighborhoods, and ballpoint scribbles, and birds living in rockets and things like that. So yeah. Number 9, I actually do not have with me. It's called The Harmless People by, I believe, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. I read this last fall semester for my anthropology class, and it's about Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. She's an anthropologist who lives with the Bushmen people of Africa for, I'm not even sure how long it is. I think it might just be a couple months. But she talks about them, and she's gotten to live with them before, and she's studied them for probably her whole career, I think. And it reignited in me this love of anthropology and archaeology and studying other cultures. I had a very, very difficult time choosing between majoring in art and majoring in anthropology. That book being one of the big reasons or big arguments for the anthropology side. I don't know, I grew up being in love with the idea of like Indiana Jones and archaeology and National Geographic. For most of my life, we had a subscription to the National Geographic magazines, and I loved looking through all the pictures and just seeing other parts of the world. And not only did it reignite my love for all of that, but it also began this sort of campaign in my life to simplify and declutter my life. I fell in love with the Bushmen people and their way of life. Number 10, I'm kind of copying my sister. This isn't really something I had thought of until I looked at her video. But number 10 is the standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. And these have been very influential in my life. They've always been a part of my life. We always talked about the scripture stories, and as I've gotten older, I've read them for myself. And even though they've been a part of my life for my entire life, just recently, in the past year or so, they've become very influential. And yeah, those are my 10 most influential books in my life. And I'm going to tag the rest of my family. So, yeah, and I hope to continue booktubing because this is really cool. Bye!